Questions? All right, let's do this. Let's have a great conversation. Myron, I'll let you take it away. Thank you all so much.
Right. Thank you all for having me. I'm Myron Metcalf. I'm an ESPN reporter, but also a columnist for the Star Tribune. I write columns that center on the black and non-white experience in Minnesota. When I was a little kid, whenever you go to my grandmother's house, she always had something cooking on the stove. And she would always ask you, did you eat? And I always wondered why my grandmother wanted to know if we had eaten. But it was a constant concern for her. And my grandmother, like so many African Americans, grew up in the Deep South, and she was fluent in the language of scarcity. And that's why as she got older and she raised her children and grandchildren, that was always her most pressing question. Did you eat? I think in Minnesota we've asked each other a lot of questions over the last 18 months about politics and policing, about so many things that could transform this entire region. But I do think it's important that we also include that question, did you eat? Which is why we're here. We know that BIPOC communities are suffering from food insecurity at twice the rate of their white counterparts, and this esteemed panel is here to have a conversation about how we can affect change, radical change, and make sure that more people are not facing these issues, especially members of BIPOC communities. So first, we're going to ask all the panelists to introduce themselves, and we will start with Celia Otoole, CEO of Feeding Texas, and I'm going to ask every panelist to introduce themselves, who they are, but also give us something that you really want people to take away from this conversation.
Well, thank you. So I'm Celia, and I run an organization called Feeding Texas, and I have the pleasure of being able to work with and support and represent 21 food banks that are all members of the Feeding America Network. Being from Texas, we have a lot of food banks. We have a lot of hunger. We have an abundance of food, and we have a brutal racist history, which we're witnessing right now along the Texas border with Haitian refugees and how they're being treated. So when I was invited to come to this conversation and talk about racism as a root cause of hunger, that felt really right to me. I'm really glad that we are naming the root cause of hunger. We are naming racism as the root cause of hunger. We've danced around that a lot for many, many decades. And I think in sort of really naming the problem, only then are we going to really find the solution. And I'm most of all excited to hear what my peers have to say today.
Next up, we have Adair Mosley, who is the CEO of Pillsbury United Communities. Adair?
Good afternoon, everyone. Adair Mosley, President and CEO of Pillsbury United Communities, a 140-year-old community and impact organization here in the Twin Cities. And I would like to say that most of our work has been anchored in one simple question or one virtue, and that is humility. Asking communities, what do you need, rather than hubris telling them, well, here's what you need. And I believe that is the thing that will chart us into our future. The one thing I think I want to make sure people understand that this work is about justice, and justice is the antithesis to poverty. And when we center justice, we're talking about systems, policies, and infrastructures that are going to be needed to stand up to eradicate really these deep and pervasive disparities, particularly right here in our Twin Cities region.
Allison Otoole is the CEO of Second Harvest Heartland. Allison?
Thanks, Myron. I always say I'm the proud CEO of Second Harvest Heartland. I'm also a proud member of Feeding America. Very honored to be here with all of you today. Ditto to a lot of what's been said here. And I think my goal today is to name it, to call it out, to put it on the table, that communities of color in Minnesota experience food insecurity at twice the rates of their white neighbors. In the Midwest, in this entire region, we have some of the starkest disparities in the country. We can do better. As a white leader, I am here to listen and learn and get to work.
Claire BennettFontenot, who is with Feeding America. Claire?
Yes. It's interesting, Allison, whenever I introduce myself and say what I do, I always say my name and that it is my great privilege to serve as CEO of Feeding America. I actually like to give a little context to why it is that being here is so personal for me, and then maybe pivot to that central question about why it's important to have the conversation. I have a really big family, and that's an understatement. I'm one of 108 children raised by my mom and dad. And when I was rather young, my parents decided that they would pivot from taking in lots of babies to focusing on teenage boys, African American boys in particular, but I didn't understand it. And 2020 reminds me of why that was so important. African Americans definitely struggle under the weight of many issues, and yet undaunted, wake up in the morning and keep on moving forward. I'm inspired by communities of color, and I'm inspired to do well by communities of color. As I talk about communities of color, I wish that the statistics that I've heard today were actually still true 2 times. Before the pandemic, roughly 38 million people were food insecure. In 2020, about 60 million people turned to the charitable food system for help. We just received USDA statistics about 2020. And we learned that the number actually remained at about 38 million people. Remarkable. It shows that we know what to do to help people, because one would have thought the number would have gone up. However, when you look beneath the surface of the numbers, you discover that there's a particular group that has done better post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. That group would not be communities of color. African Americans were the second most likely BIPOC community to suffer under the weight of food insecurity at a rate of about 2.5 times. African Americans now 3.2 times more likely to struggle with food insecurity. Native Americans have stayed steady at 3 times more likely to be food insecure in this country. And Latinos, unfortunately, have gone from roughly 2 times to about 2.5 times. So the numbers on the surface look encouraging. Right beneath the surface, you get the real story about what's happening. And because of that, I know that if we're going to commit ourselves to really doing something about hunger in America, we must commit ourselves to addressing equity in America. Thank you for having me here.
Difficult numbers to digest, but also important. Next, we have Moses Mamanu, co-owner of Dusk to Dawn Farm in Kilmore, Minnesota. Moses?
Thank you. Yes, you've heard, I have a farm in Cambridge, 20-acre organic farm. I had to train at an incubator training program in Stillwater to learn and to gain access to the network of farming before I was able to buy my farm 5 years later. We sell here in the Twin Cities. We sell vegetables, mixed vegetables at farmers markets. Last year, we decided, because of the high demand that we were getting, to train other farmers, specifically African immigrant from East Africa. We thought we'd start with 4, but by end of last year, we had 13 on the farm that were growing on a 1/4 acre to about 1/3 an acre each. This year, we have 19 farmers, and we have ended up with 3 different locations that we are incubating those farmers. But what I'd like you to take away from this is I represent all these farmers that are struggling to find space to grow. And the reason why we have all these 20 people coming all the way to Cambridge, which is 1 hour is because they feel they need to get the food they want. They will go and do it themselves. So we need to have more of that closer to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. Yeah, the food they want is important. We're going to have this conversation focusing on a couple of issues. We're going to talk about some of the most affected areas in the city of Minneapolis where there has been a racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd. We're going to have a conversation about Moses and organic farms like the one he operates. And we're also going to talk about food banks across the country and their role in all of this. Adair, when I talked about my grandmother and she asking, did you eat? For her, the illustration of the structural and systemic racism was food insecurity. Mm-hmm. How do we address food insecurity in BIPOC communities without dealing with the structural and systemic inequities that have existed across generations?
Yeah, I don't think we can address it without addressing those, again, what everyone has illustrated here, the deep and pervasive and frankly, that's rooted in white supremacy across our country. And it's baked into both policies and infrastructures. And so unless we hit at the root, which is root cause, to be able to then disrupt these downstream disparities that we're seeing, but not only food insecurity, housing insecurity, and the host and the compounding factors that are really influencing people's lives. And so I think the imperative in this moment is that we have to go structural. That this work, while all of our organizations here are representing meeting that acute need of hunger, and we still need to serve that, right? We're called to stand and do that, but at the same time, we need to be layering that up to something more transformative. And this moment causes for transformative impact. It causes for catalytic investments that are at the size and the scale of the challenge. And when we hear numbers, double digits of multiple millions of people who are facing food insecurities across our country, that's not incrementalism. That will require really transformative impact in this moment.
I appreciate that. And your organization has been working with families here since the late 1800s.
Yeah.
So clearly you've understood the issues and how they've affected communities for years and years. Celia, 1 out of 8 Texans, I believe, according to a recent federal study, are facing food insecurity. I believe it's about 3.5% higher than the national average. But there were some positives in that some of the programs, the federal programs, whether it was a moratorium on evictions, showed that they could have an impact on affecting those communities, especially BIPOC communities that are facing food insecurity. What's the value of some of the policies and the contributions from that government and community level, and how can that help sustain the fight that you and everyone here is fighting?
Sure. Well, I hate to lead off an answer with it could have been worse, but it could have been worse. And I think what we saw in the data that you just shared, Myron, and you, Claire, earlier, was it's terrible that 1 in 8 families in Texas should be struggling with hunger. But at the same time, it's a sign that government programs work, that there weren't more people struggling with hunger during the pandemic, and that at certain points in the pandemic, we saw a lower rate of food insecurity than we've seen even in great economic times. And so government programs work, and where they don't work, where they don't equitably serve people, we have a duty to really look deep and see what it is about the SNAP program that's not reaching people of color. What can we do to make these programs more equitably serve? But I think we saw that when the private charitable food assistance network came together with the right investment, that we were able to, keep a problem that could have been a lot worse at bay.
Yeah. And we're going to extend that conversation later because I think the value of teamwork and all this is so important that we're all in this together. Allison, you learned about community initiatives not from your professional experience, but your family had a drugstore growing up, right in Minneapolis, not far from where George Floyd was murdered. So you saw these things firsthand in terms of the value of community resources and the lack thereof. Money isn't everything, but we can't have this conversation without having a real dialogue about financial investment. What is your organization doing to commit to that, and how important is that, especially in the fight against food insecurity in BIPOC communities.
Thanks, Myron, and I love that you know about Otoole Drug. It is where I grew up. It was on 38th and Nicollet, just mere blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. So thanks for that connection. I am really proud and humbled to be able to announce today that Second Harvest Heartland is going to be making a transformative investment in this community in tackling the racial hunger divide. We are investing $13 million over the next 5 years to help this community do better. We have been listening and learning for the last 18 months. That listening and learning does not stop today. We're going to continue to learn from our partners like Adair and Moses and everyone else that we have the privilege to work with. This $13 million, though, to begin, we are going to work with communities of color to deliver more culturally specific food. We are going to grow Minnesota Central Kitchen to expand our reach with culturally appropriate and connected, community-connected meals, prepared meals. We are providing grants to our food shelf partners and other community organizations to keep innovating and learning on how we can do better. And finally, we are going to, well, a couple more things. We're going to invest in anti-stigma campaigns. We've seen that as an enormous barrier to accessing help in the last 18 months. We've seen it before 18 months, but boy, we've seen it in spades in the last 18 months. We are also investing in our programmatic work. When we walked into this room, Myron, we walked through our warehouse. Our warehouse has 10 million pounds of food in it. We, since the beginning of the pandemic, Second Harvest Heartland and all of our partners have distributed 170 million pounds of food in this community. And when you walk through that warehouse, it's important to remember that the SNAP program has 9 times our power. 9 times our power.
It's a lot.
And so when you think about this is a transformative investment, but this investment would not be complete without an investment in that programmatic work, so we can reach more people who don't have access to those benefits.
Thanks.
So, yeah, we are proud, we are humbled, and we are, continuing to listen and learn, and we've been working nonstop in the last 18 months and for 30 years, and we're going to keep our foot on the gas.
13 minutes is a sizable investment, and I think that this community will benefit from that. Claire, I'm fascinated by your story. I know you said you had 108 siblings, your parents raising you all, and foster siblings as well. You've been in the corporate world at Walmart, and here you are Feeding America. You've sort of seen these issues from so many different perspectives, and I believe your organization is offering 4 billion meals to 46 million people. I believe those are the numbers. What are the solutions? You have an investment. What are the solutions that can make a real impact, not just on food insecurity across the country, but specifically in the BIPOC communities that are suffering the most?
Yes. Well, let me stop and say I find it fascinating how often inside of an uncommon moment, we might let it pass without a proper amount of celebration. I want to stop and have us digest what Allison Otoole just said. One food bank in community, $13 million. I applaud you and all of you. I applaud Minnesota that the investments that have been made in this food bank and how, as a fiduciary, you're reinvesting in the community. I thank you. Thank you for that. So when you ask, what are the solutions? These are the solutions. When Allison talked about listening and learning, those are the solutions. One of the things that I've actually said now a few times, I remember growing up that I was told, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. And I remember I thought, that's perfect. It was during COVID that I realized, no, it isn't. It assumes that he needs you to teach him how to fish. It assumes that the person with the fish has the answers. And the work, the breakthroughs in this space will happen if and only if we actually go into communities in partnership without paternalism, without condescension, and provide resources that become the resources of that community. We don't go into the community with a bunch of strings attached. And you alluded to it earlier, Myron. We don't go into the community telling the community what the community needs. We go into a community asking the community what the community needs. And as it relates to policy, which is absolutely critical to the work Feeding America as an organization, both as individual food banks as well as a national platform, we work really hard at advocacy. So we use our collective voices to help to inform and shape national policy, not only directly associated with food, though we are probably, well, I'm confident we are one of the most powerful voices for SNAP in this country. We take it seriously because we understand the multiplier effect for SNAP. But we use our voices beyond SNAP too. Because as a network, we have an aspiration for an America where no one is hungry. That will not happen if the wheel doesn't get broken, and we have to be a part of breaking it. So, thank you.
Like Claire, yeah, the investment is a monumental thing, and again, I think it speaks to the commitment that goes beyond words. Moses, you've had an interesting journey. You majored in accounting, and then you decided that you wanted to go into farming, and now you've created this entire network of individuals who are following in your footsteps, learning how to grow their own food. Why is that important, and what level of support do you need to continue to do the work that you hope to do in this community?
I see the farmers who are training with me doing the same thing I'm doing. And I always tell myself, if only one farmer of all these farmers did train one more other farmer, we would have that growth. Remember, the community, the farmers who are growing the food that feeds the community need to look like the community itself. So one thing I would, actually, the second thing that motivates me every day is I have children. And I would, if I grew up doing hide and seek in the cornfield back in Africa, I always think my children should be doing that. So what I'm saying is, I want my children to have a connection to land. That's also another motivation. And what I wish, like the bigger community will do, is open this two-way lane between the eater and the farmer. Maybe right now we just have a one-way, whereby we have farmers producing produce and just moving it to the eaters, but we are not getting out of the eaters and out of the community, farmers going back to the farm to, to the source where this, like she was saying, teach them how to fish, not just eat. So we want programs that will enable our children and those people like the farmers who are coming out to my farm to get access to the land and prepare themselves and eventually be able to buy their own places, their own farms.
Ownership.
And grow foods. So that's kind of what I think as a two-way lane for me.
This panel is amazing. I mean, this is sort of like the Marvel Avengers panel of food insecurity. If you all don't understand that. There are a lot of things we want to hit here in the next 10 to 15 minutes we have. So we'll keep some of our answers shorter, just so we can hit as much as we can. Adair, I write a column for the Star Tribune on race, and I wish people could see the emails I get from people. If they think a racial reckoning has happened in Minnesota, I'll forward you what I get each week, right? And it makes me go, okay, how real is all of this? How sustainable is it? Does this go beyond words? What confidence do you have that what's transpired over the last 18 months is going to lead to real momentum to affect change in the area that you're most passionate about when it comes to food insecurity in BIPOC communities?
Yeah, I believe from a federal level, and as Claire has mentioned, right, the policies and the safety nets, such as SNAP and other things that were shored up during that moment need to be sustained. We know that those are solutions that work. It is no longer a narrative about us not having the resources. It's about our value around those resources and how we allocate them. The other thing that what I'm just so heartened by in this particular region is that I did get a lot of calls as a community-based organizations from philanthropy asking in that moment, what do you need? Not only what do you need for sustainability of the organization, but what do your communities need to be able to meet this moment? And if they continue to move forward in asking that simple question, that organizations that are serving, that have proximity to community and are serving them will be able to get, and that is the way we will achieve this equity. And so I'm heartened by our food supporters that both Allison and I share, like General Mills and Cargill, all of them asking those basic questions of what do you need in this moment. So that gives me hope. Hope is on the horizon.
Allison, I agreed to do this because you asked, and I thought it was important that you were someone who organized this as a white woman in a community that's saying, you know, hey, we need to partner. We need to have these bonds between communities of color and, you know, white individuals in this area. Why was it important to you to make sure that you reached out to BIPOC communities, organizations, to not only have the $13 million investment, but to also create these partnerships that can affect change long term?
So I think my personal and professional beliefs are aligned here. I feel like I have a deep responsibility as a lifelong Minnesotan to continue this conversation. I also have a responsibility as the leader of one of the largest nonprofit organizations in this state to help this conversation move forward. And this whole team, I've never been prouder of a team and this whole network. Everyone's been doing really heavy lifting. We're all headed in the same direction. And that gives me enormous hope. And my goal is to keep that momentum going.
So in Texas, you obviously are networking with so many different organizations. I think about Moses, and what Moses is saying is, hey, we need support. There's so many people like me who want to do more. What is the value of an organization like yours in Feeding Texas partnering and supporting groups like the one that Moses operates?
Yeah, well, we're really fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, in Texas to have a tremendous amount of food being grown. And to me, the sort of at the heart of equity is that anyone in America, regardless of age, race, or place, has access to food. And in Texas, we have a lot of food. And so we have a produce sharing program. It's a public-private partnership, and it's been in place for 20 years right now. And the state actually funds the program along with the food banks raise money for it. And basically it allows us to source produce, surplus produce from growers, whether that's produce they can't sell and the funding helps them harvest it, or produce that is perfectly nutritious and edible but completely imperfect looking and won't make it to the market. So those funds help them support those farmers and at the same time help us fight hunger and improve health. And then we're also working locally. Some food banks have done a lot of work with local farmers to help create markets for them and consumers by bringing farmers markets, setting up farmers markets, and then bringing resources to the table so that people can use their SNAP and their WIC benefits at that market. So it's really creating access points for people for the kind of food that they need, but then creating a market at that same time for that local farmer. And I just think it's critical for us to be able to do this. This program that I just described is called the Texans Feeding Texans program, which I love because it acknowledges that the people who are giving and growing are also the people who are often have lived experience of hunger themselves.
Claire, I'm fortunate that my three girls don't have to think about food insecurity. I think about the 11 or 12-year-old boy or girl in Minneapolis who woke up this morning and they didn't know where the next meal was coming from. They didn't know if they'd come home and there would be food. These are all incredible programs, and these investments are amazing. But how do we affect that young person? How do we get them from this morning wondering where their next meal is coming from to a place of security?
Mm-hmm. I love that you framed it in the way that you did, because I think embedded in that framing is an acknowledgement that there are immediate acute needs that need to be addressed. And then there are mid and long-term needs that need to be addressed. And where I think that our network of food banks have been best in class has been in the farmer. And truth be told, I think because we are so good at connecting people with food, we've sometimes maybe thought of ourselves as being in the food business when we're in the people business, not the food business. When you're in the people business, you're going to care about every single one of those kids and how they make it through that day, but you're also going to care about how they make it through their lifetimes. So I believe that what's going to be essential is that we get better and better at delivering on the promise of distributing food to people who need it today, and that we take the time, the energy, the effort to learn, to do better when we know better, but with that learning, to use that learning and apply it and address some of these systemic issues that really do need to be addressed, as Adair so eloquently spoke to just a few minutes ago. I actually took may I talk about a quick picture that I took? I'm going to try to make it brief. But when I was in here just a few minutes ago, as fate would have it, I sat in a room that's called the Rosie Room, because here in their conference rooms, actually named the conference rooms after people that they've served, people from the community. I was in the Rosie Room, and Rosie has received food from one of the local pantries here. She goes and she gets access, and it's called Shelves in Minnesota, one of the shelves here in Minnesota, and she has a beautiful smile. She's a beautiful Black woman. And she says what her goal is, and it just struck me, so I want to share it. She says, my biggest goal is to live life to the fullest. Isn't that everybody's biggest goal?
Yeah, it is.
Isn't that absolutely everybody's biggest goal? We are well positioned to realize that for everybody in ways that today it simply is not realized.
Allison, my daughter goes to school in town, and there's a food shelf there. And every Wednesday when I go to pick her up, there are cars out on the street. Some people are driving older models. Some people are driving luxury cars. There are families in 3 or 4. There are single mothers and single fathers. I say that to ask, what does hunger look like? And why is it important to understand that before folks set out to try to address food insecurity?
It's really important to understand it. So I'll say 2 things. First, hunger is in every single community, in every neighborhood. So you mentioned range of cars and family situations there. During the pandemic in this last 18 months, 60% of the people we helped had never accessed support before.
60%?
60%.
Wow, that's a big number.
And so, it impacted my neighbors, your neighbors, everyone's neighbors. But we need to go a little deeper than that. And I think what we've learned and what Claire mentioned and what everyone at these tables are mentioning, it's our responsibility to go deeper and understand that communities of color are facing at least twice the rates of food insecurity that their white neighbors. And so we have to keep our eye on both balls, but get really sharp and focused about dismantling the systemic barriers that we're seeing that are causing some of the greatest disparities in the country right here.
Claire, you operate what I believe is the largest charity in America, according to Forbes. There are obviously government policies and initiatives. How important is that? How important is it to get that assistance and for it to be sustained?
Well, we certainly are the largest hunger relief organization in the United States, and it's absolutely critical. And one of the things that I find particularly rewarding about this work is it's one of the things. It's a 100% issue, Myron. It's something that we can all agree on. And in fact, even in the midst of all that we've seen, where people have found so many things to disagree about, this is one of the places that we actually have agreed on. One of the places that we've had bipartisan support for throughout the pandemic. Unprecedented government assistance during unprecedented need in a bipartisan way. It has to remain that way. And by the way, you gave a statistic from the year before the pandemic, which is a big number, 4.7 billion pounds of food. You know, in the middle of a global health pandemic, when food systems shut down, when farmers were throwing away their food because they couldn't match their food with people in need, but there were these lines, miles long, of people showing up at food distributions. When retailers who have always been a primary source of contributions for our network had empty shelves, during that year, 2020, this network actually provided 6.1 billion meals to people in need. So I think we've got to stop and reflect and be proud of the work that we've done together. That was done in Minnesota in ways that had never been done before. Unprecedented contribution, unprecedented investment. The people of Minnesota deserve to be proud of that. The country deserves to be proud of that. And then with that, we need to use that to buoy us to say, and therefore, how are we going to ensure that we stay in this for the marathon that it is, because it's not a sprint, and how are we going to ensure that people don't need to come to the charitable food system in order to feed themselves and their families? So I'm energized and buoyed, like my people. I'm undaunted, but there is tough work ahead, and we've got to be ready for it.
I think time is sort of winding up here, but I want to end with making sure I go to every panelist and asking them about hope. I'm always having these conversations with my colleagues and friends. A friend of mine, Dr. Daniel Brown at University of Minnesota, we're always having this conversation, well, where's the hope? Because sometimes you look around and you go, I don't know where it is. Celia, for you, what is the hope? Where is it? And I'd like every panelist to end by telling us something that seems hopeful right now that they're trying to align themselves with and attach themselves to.
Well, I think the extent to which young people of color stood up and spoke out and voted in the last election gave me a lot of hope. And I think, you know, it's if we can continue to build power in the communities we serve and continue to engage community members, people with lived experience in pushing for change, I think it's going to be very powerful. We're going to really increase our powers in that work.
Adair.
Yeah, I think the hope for me is that everything's on the table. And so we're no longer hiding behind narratives and closed doors and having conversations, that everything's on the table, so we have a unique opportunity to tackle it because it's transparent in this moment, and there's organizations and there's freedom fighters that are aligned and pushing towards that. So hopefully it's sustained and we all have the energy and the fuel that we need to chart towards justice.
Allison.
Today gives me hope. We're having an honest conversation about the realities of food insecurity in our community, and that it gives me hope. I'll tell you the other thing that gives me hope every single day is walking into this building, talking with our partners, and being part of this team at Second Harvest Heartland.
Claire.
Yeah, when I talk about my privilege in this role, among my privileges is that since the pandemic started, since March of last year, I've visited over 90 food banks. Wow. And I've visited across the country in countless food distributions. I have not had to struggle to find hope. I find it in every every visit, every community, on both sides of that line. When I hear someone receiving food say, I'm going to get out of this line, and because of the help this organization provided, I'm going to get on the other side of it, and I'm going to help too. When I see people who leave their homes in the middle of a pandemic to come and volunteer in a line, I have hope. I have hope all the time, and I see other people who seem like they don't have it, and I wish I had an opportunity to just bottle some of mine and pass it around, Myron. I've got lots of hope.
Moses, for you, what's the hope?
Yeah, since last year, I have had, more people involved in conversations about food justice. And, as long as there's the conversation going on and there are people listening, there are questions asked, to me that is hope, because we'll just keep screaming or shouting. I don't know which word to use, but we'll keep talking about it, and that is hope, because if it is said, at least, somebody has heard about it.
Well, my hope is, too often I think about who's left the fight instead of remembering who's still in it. I think today is a good reminder that the fight continues. I think that's important. I want to thank all of our guests. Incredible event, incredible, I think, perspective. We have some questions. For this one's for Allison, and then we're going to go to everyone on this. $13 million is a large sum. How are you going to ensure that this actually reaches the people who need it most at the surface level?
Yeah, that's the hard part, right? And like I said a little earlier, we have been listening and learning for 30 years, but in a different way in the last 18 months. We have to continue listening and learning to the network, to the people who need help, so we get it right. It's our responsibility to get it right. So we know we have, in the last 18 months, we've learned a lot. We're putting that into action, and that 13 million, the next investment, will be even more informed. And I can't wait. And I like to, I mentioned this team earlier, but it's really the entire network. We have been innovating every second of every day during the pandemic. It's not going to stop. I have total hope that it's not going to stop.
Hope is good.
But it's a great question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Claire, you do this at the national level. I mean, what's your response when people say, well, how do you get it to the people who need it most?
Yeah. Well, as one example, we've created an equity impact fund during this pandemic. And there are only really two rules related to the substantial resources that are being invested into that fund. The first rule is that those monies must be used to decrease racial disparities inside of communities. The second rule is the communities get to decide what to do with it. Way too often, national organizations such as the one that I am privileged to serve in, again, think we know the answers. So we spend the money on us. We spend the money on our training, on our development, on our thinking. We're going to be investing inside of communities. And we have partners all over the country. So we have partners like Adair and Moses and Allison. There's no reason why we can't break this wheel, and that's the way we're going to do it. So thanks for the question.
Adair, you're doing this at the ground level as well, and your organization has more than 100 years of experience. How do you get those resources to those people who need it most?
Yeah, I think it's the value of the organization to be in relationship, to be in proximity with community, and also hiring individuals who look like the communities in which we serve. And so that holds us accountable to each other. And it's, while I think we're all alarmed by the amount of food that we had to give out during a moment of disruption and chaos across our country, but at the same time knowing that we were a trusted institution, that people felt safe enough, that they felt enough in relationship with us to be able to access. And, year to date, we've handed out about 1.3 million pounds of food. In 2021, 1,000 meals a week. And that says that people trust the institution, and that they know that when they come there, that it will be with grace and humility. And that's only because of the wonderful leaders that I have inside of the organization. I'm not the leader. I'm fortunate to lead a bunch of other leaders. And so that's apparent.
Celia, I think that trust will be very important. I mean, you're operating the largest network, hunger relief network in Texas. What is the value of that? Is people ask that same question. Well, how does all that money get to us? How do the resources get to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think we always talk about, we're a network of 21 food banks, but 3,000 partners. And I think having those trusted relationships in the community is clearly really important. I think having an equity framework driving decisions about where to invest money, where to set up programs, where to fill gaps, and making sure that that equity framework ensures that people who are affected by those decisions are in the room when those decisions are being made is really important. And both Claire and Allison spoke to just the amazing work that food banks did, the ways in which they reinvented themselves overnight to respond to the challenges of the pandemic. But the pandemic also exposed weaknesses in our network. And I think if we want to be driving equity, we need to be investing in a distribution network and in partnerships that get food to people where they are. And that's something we're really committed to doing in Texas.
Getting food to people where they are is what you're doing, Moses. Mm-hmm. People are owning, there's a sense of ownership. They're growing their own food. This question is, what are the biggest barriers to land access to you and the people that you work with?
I think it's the 400 years that have been, the policies that have led to that thinking that, I can't own farms, I can't own a farm 100 acres out there. So structural barriers are there. Can't get a loan because you don't have a network that can help you secure that loan. You are struggling with your bills. The kids have grown up not knowing where the food comes from. How are they going to, all these things. So there are just a whole list of barriers that can prevent people of color from getting land. An immigrant coming here, they don't think they are coming here to buy land. They are coming here maybe to work. So those are the things. But we need to show them that, you can buy land is part of your dream. You can grow food. You can be part of the programming that is done along the, farming and food. So the money that we are talking about here could be used to grow or nurture people into doing farming and food-related things. Right from colleges, we don't have young people taking agriculture in colleges. So all these things, but we can program some of the money towards these other things, and that's what I think. Yeah. And then, say we're going to have 50 farms in the next 5 years out of this money. Mm-hmm. Where are the farmers who, so we can help them? That's all I can say. Mm.
I think it's very important that you hit on the lack of trust because of policies. I mean, there are so many black farmers across this country who have had land and it was taken from them. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that's something that a potential farmer would have to think about before they invest in learning and then perhaps going toward ownership. This question is for everyone. I think it's a very important question. I'll start with Allison. What sort of anti-poverty work would make the biggest impact on hunger in Minnesota?
Well, I mentioned the SNAP program. I think that is one of our sharpest tools that we can use, and boosting that up. We have seen it work during this pandemic. I will also mention, a lot of the USDA statistics show that many of the policies that were in place during the pandemic are working. The enhanced child tax credit is a game changer. It will lift millions of families and children out of poverty, and it already has. So it's like it's a neighbor. SNAP and the child tax credit, I think, go hand in hand, but the policies we've seen, I credit the bipartisan approach in Washington around food insecurity during the pandemic. It needs to continue. It can't stop. But those two programs are game changers.
Claire?
Myron, I agree with everything that she said, so I'll say something that's a little bit, it's related, but not exactly the same point. What so many people don't understand in this country is that while as powerful as SNAP is, there are millions of people who qualify for SNAP, technically, who don't get access to it. And there are two primary reasons why not. The first one is, while it's federal legislation, it's administered locally, and there are often a lot of barriers, state and local barriers, to people actually getting access. So the feds have allocated money, they put it aside, they're ready to use it, and it doesn't get used because people have these onerous burdens that are unnecessary. And part of the work that we have to do with partners like Celia and other partners on the state level is to work through how do we make it easy for people to access what they're entitled to under that federal law. The second is that people don't even realize they're entitled to it.
Yep.
So helping people to understand that when you're a poor college student and you're barely getting by, that you probably qualify for SNAP. And that while you might still need yourself a second job, you might not need two jobs on the side while you're going to college, because you might be able to actually get the groceries that you need. So an education around whom it is that's entitled to the benefits, and serious work in making certain that people who are qualified get access to it. And Feeding America at a national level is doing deep investments in both of those spaces. So we do the federal policy interventions, but we're now really going deep. We're the largest SNAP application provider, facilitator in the country.
Wow.
And that's a tip of the iceberg. There's so many more people who are eligible who aren't getting access. So we're going to be working at doing that too. So, and everything that Allison said.
And Myron, part of the $13 million investment is around a food resource center here at Second Harvest Heartland to do exactly what Claire's talking about, to connect the benefits.
I think that's such an important point, because some of these programs have been in place for so long, Adair. I wonder how much of it is maybe the perception of people who maybe they're in need, but they don't want to maybe gain access to a program like that for whatever reason. How much of a factor is that in trying to educate people who might qualify for some of these benefits?
Yeah, I think what's going to be really important about the work that Allison is leading is the kind of the stigmatism that relates to a lot of these programs. One of the things that we also found out when we built a grocery store 4 years ago, North Market, but it started with looking actually at the WIC program and understanding why at the state level we have a high utilization of the rate, but we saw a drop off after the first year of birth. And part of that was access to the program, understanding the distance in traveling. But the other thing that we also found, that even the name of the WIC program, Women, Infant, and Children, single parent headed households that were ran by fathers, individuals that didn't know that they qualify. And so there's antiquated language policies that still sit on the books that are disenfranchising individuals from those types of programs. What I'll also add as different but compounding on the things that they've mentioned is that we need to be talking about education, early childhood. We need to be talking about income. We need more policies that increase the supply of affordable housing, incentives. Most of, and especially in the urban core, households are cost burdened by rent, and simply don't have the type of income that allow to be able to support their families. So they're making choices, literally, that it's also feeding into that food insecurity. And then I would also add policies that look at incentivizing the farmer so that we can have increased access, more grocery stores in our urban core, where there's just the food apartheid that sits in across our urban communities and rural, because we've seen many grocery stores across rural America close. That is all feeding this narrative around food insecurity.
Myron, if you would indulge me, may I ask something of Celia as she
Please.
responds to your question? There's some powerful work that Eric Cooper and the team are doing around housing in the state of Texas. I wonder if she might even address that as we're talking about it.
Oh, well, I think Eric Cooper runs the San Antonio Food Bank, and they are, I think, really kind of a thought leader and out in front on addressing kind of the intersections between hunger and housing and hunger and health. And so they're actually looking at building low-income housing. And then I think just short of actually building low-income housing is creating resource centers, which a number of food banks in Texas have done as well, where it's like a one-stop shop where it acknowledges that hunger is an intersectional issue, and so someone can come and get help with things beyond food. But yeah, I just want to echo, also what Adair said about housing and income, healthcare, childcare. I mean, we saw the benefit of those investments in families and in workers during the pandemic, and we need to continue that kind of investment. We need to invest in the kind of things that make families healthy and workers productive and successful.
Yep.
Adair, I grew up in Milwaukee with a Black-owned drugstore in our community that we would go to and get everything we need, and there was a sense of ownership with that. With the North Market and what you've done in North Minneapolis, what has been the impact of that investment on that community, and can that be duplicated? Can that be a model for other communities around the country to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I get calls across the country, Wichita, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Raleigh, even cities like Detroit that have infrastructure. And so it is a model, and everyone can build their own North Market that's very unique and tailored to the communities in which they serve. What it has done, I think at its highest level for particularly the North Minneapolis community, is restore dignity that we didn't, that you didn't know was absent, right? What Claire pointed out is the resiliency of our people. We will make a way out of no way. And so what people have done is they get on the bus and travel the 3 miles, and it becomes somewhat normal. But that's not normal, that they should have access to a grocery store right in their community. And so it has restored that dignity. The other tangible assets from it is if you go there, you see the kind of it's an economic catalyst. It's providing living wage jobs for over 20 North Minneapolis residents. It's spurring other economic development with Houston White, that's directly across the street, who is now building a center for Black excellence. It has a library next door, and we're thinking about the entire corridor revitalization. So grocery stores are anchor institutions. And as we've branded it, it's more than a grocery store. It's the intersection of both health and community. And so I think that model can be replicated across many communities in our country.
I believe that is our last question. I'm going to thank Celia, Adair, Allison, Claire, Moses, for I think it was an incredible dialogue that gives us a lot of hope for, I think, what's ahead. I mean, here in Minneapolis, we are dealing with these things daily. After what happened to George Floyd, remember, he didn't die, he was murdered. And it's important that in all these conversations that food insecurity, like I said, when my grandmother would ask me, did you eat, is one of those pertinent questions that we make sure we address as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Myron.
Myron.
Thank you,
Thank
Myron.
you.
Thank you.
All right.
Oh, thanks, team.